My first night in the apartment was anything but normal. Moving in was exhausting. I'd spent the entire day unpacking boxes, cleaning, and trying to make the place feel like home. By the time I finished, it was late, and a storm had rolled in. The wind outside was relentless, howling against the windows like it was trying to get inside. I had one last box to bring up, and the thought of lugging it up 3 flights of stairs made me groan. That's when my neighbor, Mr. Carson, showed up. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a kind but quiet demeanor. He offered to help, and I was too tired to say no. Together, we carried the box to the elevator at the end of the hall. The elevator looked like it had seen better days. The doors were scratched, the buttons on the panel flickered faintly, and the whole thing gave off this faint metallic smell. Still, it was better than the stairs, so I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder this time. Still nothing. Mr. Carson just stood there, watching quietly. I tried pressing the button for other floors, but the elevator didn't budge. Frustrated, I turned to him and asked, "Does this thing even work?" "It does," he said, his voice calm. "Try stepping in by yourself." I gave him a confused look, but I was too tired to argue. I stepped back inside the elevator with the box while he stayed in the hallway. As soon as the doors slid shut, the elevator jerked to life, slowly creaking its way up to my floor. When I got out on the 3rd floor, I found Mr. Carson already there, leaning against the wall near my apartment door. He must have taken the stairs. He gave me a small smile and said, "It's an old building. The elevator's a bit particular." Then he nodded goodnight and walked away. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a weird glitch, or maybe the elevator couldn't handle too much weight. Still, as I lay in bed that night listening to the storm outside, I couldn't shake the strange feeling I'd had in that elevator. And Mr. Carson's comment, it stuck with me. The building had a certain vibe. It wasn't shiny or modern. In fact, it was pretty old, the kind of place you'd pass on the street without giving it a second glance. The brickwork was worn, the windows a little foggy, and the paint on the railings chipped, but it felt solid, like it had been standing there forever, watching the world change around it. When I first moved in, I thought it had its charms. It was quiet, the rent was surprisingly affordable, and the hallways had this old-school feel, dimly lit with patterned carpets and creaky floorboards. I figured it was just one of those old buildings with character. The first person I met there was Mr. Carson, my neighbor. He was the kind of guy you barely notice, a quiet older man who kept to himself. Then there was Mrs. Delgado, who lived a few doors down. She was tiny, probably in her 70s, and always seemed to have something baking. The hallway outside her door smelled like cookies most of the time. She was sweet, always offering advice or little stories about the neighborhood. There were others too. A single mom with her 2 kids who always seemed to be rushing somewhere, a young guy who always had his headphones on, and a couple who argued just loud enough for you to hear the occasional word through the walls. Everyone seemed normal, just neighbors living their lives. The building manager, Hank, stood out the most. He was tall and gruff, the kind of guy who looked like he didn't take nonsense from anyone. When I went to pick up my keys, he handed them over without much of a smile and said, "Don't lose these." "I don't have extras." When I asked him about the building, he softened a little. He told me it had been around for decades and had seen it all. He knocked on the wall with a kind of pride, saying, "Built to last." Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "The elevator's special." I paused. "Special how?" He shrugged, like he wasn't sure how to explain. "It's, particular. If it doesn't work right away, just give it a second. Don't push it too hard." I laughed, assuming he meant the elevator was old and temperamental, but the way he said it made me curious. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. Hank just looked at me for a second, then said, "You'll figure it out." It was a weird thing to say, but I brushed it off. Old buildings always had their quirks, right? I figured it was just a way of saying, don't get mad if it acts up. At first, the elevator seemed fine. It was a little shaky, sure, and the buttons flickered sometimes, but it got me where I needed to go. Nothing about it stood out. But as the days went on, little things started catching my attention. For one, the elevator seemed almost too quiet when I rode it alone, like it was holding its breath. And it always stopped at my floor a little too smoothly, like it was anticipating me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it was enough to make me notice. The rest of the building felt normal enough. My apartment was cozy, if a bit old-fashioned, with creaky floors and a radiator that made way too much noise. The windows looked out onto the street, where I'd sometimes see a stray cat or a couple of kids playing. At first, I thought I'd lucked out. The rent was cheap, the neighbors seemed nice, and everything worked, mostly. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Hank had said. The elevator's special. It sounded silly, but the more I used it, the more it stuck with me. Little did I know I was about to find out just how special it really was. It didn't take long for me to notice something strange about the elevator. A few days after moving in, I realized it only worked if I was alone. If someone else was with me, no matter how many times we pushed the button, the elevator wouldn't move. But as soon as they stepped out, the doors would close and it would start up like nothing was wrong. At first, I thought it was just old and finicky. Maybe the weight sensor wasn't working right, or the wiring was bad. It was annoying, sure, but I chalked it up to the building's age. One night, after grabbing groceries, I came back to the building. The hallways were unusually quiet, and I was exhausted. I pressed the elevator button, and the doors creaked open. The light inside was flickering slightly, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get upstairs and put my bags down. I stepped in, pressed the button for my floor, and leaned against the wall as the elevator began its slow climb. Then, halfway up, it stopped. At first, I thought it was just a hiccup. Old elevators did that sometimes, right? But as I stood there waiting, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft I thought I might be imagining it, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and I couldn't make out any words. It just sounded wrong, like it didn't belong. I stood frozen, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like forever, the elevator lurched back to life and continued its climb. When the doors finally opened on my floor, I practically ran out, groceries and all. I didn't even look back. The next day, I decided to ask around. Maybe one of the neighbors had dealt with the same thing. Mrs. Delgado was the first person I asked. She smiled warmly when I brought it up, but her response was vague. "Oh, that old thing," she said, waving her hand. "It's just peculiar. Doesn't like too much company." "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged. "It's just how it's always been. Don't worry about it." That wasn't exactly comforting. I tried asking Mr. Carson, my neighbor. He was quiet as usual, but when I mentioned the elevator, he gave me this strange look and said, "You should just use it like it wants, don't push your luck." The most unsettling response came from Mr. Garvey, an elderly man who lived on the top floor. I caught him as he was coming back to his apartment, and I asked him if he'd noticed anything strange about the elevator. He stopped and stared at me for a moment before saying, "It's better that way." I frowned. "What's better that way?" He shook his head and muttered, "Just don't try to change it," before disappearing into his apartment. That night I had no choice but to use the elevator again. I'd spent all day running errands and was too tired to take the stairs. The building was quiet as usual, and as I stepped into the elevator, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I pressed the button for my floor and the doors slid shut. The ride started normally enough, but halfway up, the light began to flicker again. Then, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound was enough to send chills down my spine. It felt like the walls themselves were whispering, closing in around me. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm, but the elevator stopped again, this time between floors. The light flickered once more before going out completely, leaving me in total darkness. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, and I fumbled for my phone. As soon as I turned on the flashlight, the elevator jolted back to life and started moving again. When the doors opened on my floor, I didn't waste a second. I darted out, my phone light still on, and hurried to my apartment. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that elevator. It wasn't just old or broken. It felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. The neighbors' cryptic responses only made it worse. Why wouldn't they just tell me what was going on? And why did they all seem so resigned to it? I didn't have any answers yet, but one thing was clear. There was something seriously wrong with that elevator, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. After the weird things that had already happened, I couldn't stop thinking about the elevator. It wasn't just broken or old. It felt like it had its own set of rules. Rules I didn't understand, but was somehow expected to follow. One evening, my friend Alex came over. They're the type of person who doesn't believe in anything remotely supernatural. I told them about the elevator, how it only worked when I was alone, and of course, they laughed it off. "Let's try it," Alex said, grinning like it was a game. When it was time for them to leave, we stepped into the elevator together. I hit the button for the lobby, but nothing happened. Alex frowned and pressed it again. Still nothing. We tried a few other buttons, but the elevator wouldn't budge. Finally, Alex sighed and said, "Fine, I'll get out and take the stairs." The second they stepped out, the doors closed and the elevator started moving. When I got to the lobby, Alex was already there, waiting. They looked at me, half amused and half spooked. "Okay," they said. "That's odd." After that, I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was going on. I started digging into the building's history, searching online for anything that might explain it. Most of what I found was pretty normal: ads for apartments, old complaints about maintenance. But then I found an article about a tragic accident. Decades ago, a repairman had died in the elevator shaft. He was working alone late at night when something went wrong, and he fell to his death. The article was brief, but it ended with a line that stuck with me. "Some believe his spirit still lingers." I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't rule it out. Not long after I found that article, things started getting worse. One night, the elevator stopped between floors again. I waited for it to start moving, but it didn't. Instead, the light inside dimmed, and I saw it, a shadow on the wall. There was no one else in the elevator, and I couldn't figure out where the shadow was coming from. It moved slowly, like it was pacing before fading away. Another time I heard muffled voices. They weren't whispers this time. They sounded like laughter, faint but eerie. I spun around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but I was alone. And then there were the long pauses. The elevator started stopping between floors for longer and longer stretches. It felt deliberate, like it was trying to make me uncomfortable. The worst part was the feeling I got whenever I was inside. It wasn't just the sounds or the shadows, it was the air. It felt heavier, like something unseen was sharing the space with me. At this point, I was avoiding the elevator whenever I could. I used the stairs most of the time, even when I had heavy groceries or bags. But there were moments when I had no choice but to get on, and every time, I felt like I was tempting fate. One night, I brought it up with Lisa, a neighbor on the second floor. She was the kind of person who seemed to know everything about the building. If anyone could explain what was going on, it was her. When I asked her about the elevator, her face changed. She looked nervous. "You shouldn't mess with it," she said. "What does that mean?" I asked. She hesitated before replying. "It's just the way things are here." The elevator doesn't like being disrespected. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she quickly ended the conversation and went back into her apartment. That night, as I tried to sleep, her words stuck with me. How could an elevator feel disrespected? And why did everyone else in the building seem to accept it without question? I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling more uneasy than ever. I had no answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whatever was going on, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Everything about the elevator was too strange, and the neighbors' cryptic warnings didn't help. So I went to see Hank, the building manager. I found him in his office, sipping coffee and flipping through papers. He looked up when I walked in and sighed. "What now?" he asked. "It's the elevator," I said. "There's something wrong with it. It's not just old or broken. There's more to it, isn't there?" Hank rubbed his forehead, clearly annoyed. "It's an old building. The elevator's got quirks." I wasn't letting it go. Quirks don't explain everything that's been happening. What's really going on? He stared at me for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "You really want to know?" I nodded. Hank sighed deeply. "All right. Decades ago, before my time, there were incidents. People got hurt. Some died. Every single time it happened when someone broke the rule." "What rule?" I asked. "Only one person in the elevator at a time," he said firmly. I blinked, confused. "Why does that matter?" Hank shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Nobody knows for sure. The last incident was a long time ago. After that, the rule stuck and things got quiet. I'm telling you this for your own good. Don't push it." "Push what?" I pressed. "What happens if I break the rule?" Hank's face darkened. "Just don't." I left his office more confused than ever. His warning sounded ridiculous, but the way he'd said it made my skin crawl. The more I thought about Hank's words, the more I wanted to test them. I mean, how bad could it really be? One evening, I convinced Lisa, my neighbor from the second floor, to help me. She was hesitant, but finally agreed. "This is a bad idea," she muttered as we stepped into the elevator together. "It's just an old elevator," I said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing's going to happen." I pressed the button for my floor. The elevator didn't move. Lisa frowned. "See, it doesn't like this. Let's just..." Before she could finish, the elevator jerked violently, slamming us against the walls. The lights flickered, and a heavy, suffocating air filled the space. "What's happening?" Lisa gasped, gripping the railing. "I don't know," I shouted, frantically pressing buttons. None of them worked. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like distant murmurs, but they grew louder, overlapping and echoing. It sounded like voices arguing, angry and relentless. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in the flickering light. Lisa was panicking, her breathing quick and shallow. "I can't," she started, but then she collapsed, slumping to the floor. "Lisa!" I dropped to my knees beside her, shaking her shoulder. She was still breathing, but completely unresponsive. At that moment, the elevator jolted again, and the whispers stopped. The air felt lighter, and the light steadied. Slowly, the elevator began to move. When the doors opened on my floor, I dragged Lisa out as fast as I could. It took a while for Lisa to calm down. She sat on my couch, clutching a glass of water. Her hands were shaking. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't think it's just an old elevator." Lisa refused to talk about it after that night. She avoided the elevator completely, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I couldn't stop thinking about Hank's warning. The rule wasn't just some silly superstition, it was real, and breaking it came with consequences. I didn't know what the elevator wanted, but one thing was clear. It wasn't done with me, Yi. I couldn't let it go. No matter how much I tried to push the elevator out of my mind, the fear and curiosity kept gnawing at me. I needed to understand why this was happening. Digging deeper, I found more details about the repairman who had died decades ago. His name was Richard Grant, and his death wasn't just an accident. Richard had been sabotaging the elevator. He was angry at one of the tenants, though the records didn't say why. It seemed like he'd planned to get back at them by making the elevator malfunction, but things went horribly wrong. One night, while working late, Richard became trapped in the elevator shaft. He was alone, unable to call for help, and he died there. Some reports claimed he cursed the elevator as he died, vowing that no one would use it freely. Not long after his death, strange things started happening. Residents heard voices in the elevator, saw shadows, and experienced sudden malfunctions. That's when the rule started. The elevator only worked if you rode it alone. I sat back, staring at my computer screen. A man full of anger and revenge died alone, and now his presence lingered, demanding solitude. Everything I'd experienced, Lisa collapsing, the whispers, the strange behavior, it all made sense. After learning the truth, I avoided the elevator completely. I started taking the stairs every chance I got, no matter how inconvenient. But one night during a storm, the power went out. I came home late, exhausted, and the stairwell was completely dark. My phone was dead, and I couldn't see a thing. The elevator, for some reason, still had power. I stood there in front of it, debating what to do. My gut screamed at me to stay away, but I didn't have another option. I couldn't climb 3 flights of stairs blind. With shaky hands, I pressed the button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator began its climb. At first, it seemed normal, but as the elevator rose, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath fogging the air. Then the whispers started again. They were soft at first, barely noticeable, but as the elevator kept moving, they grew louder. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a chorus of them, overlapping. Their words impossible to understand, but full of anger. My heart raced, and I clutched the railing, willing the elevator to move faster. And then, I saw it. In the mirror on the back wall, there was a figure. It was faint and shadowy, standing in the corner of the elevator. I froze, too scared to move. Slowly, I turned to look, but the corner was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a crushing silence. The air felt heavy, and my chest tightened. The elevator jerked suddenly, making me stumble. A moment later, the doors slid open on my floor. I didn't waste a second. I ran out, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was safe inside my apartment with the door locked behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the shadowy figure in the mirror, hearing the whispers in my head. Now I understood why the rule existed. The elevator wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, it demanded solitude, and breaking that rule came with consequences. The rule wasn't about superstition, it was about survival. I couldn't let it go. No matter how much I tried to push the elevator out of my mind, the fear and curiosity kept gnawing at me. I needed to understand why this was happening. Digging deeper, I found more details about the repairman who had died decades ago. His name was Richard Grant, and his death wasn't just an accident. Richard had been sabotaging the elevator. He was angry at one of the tenants, though the records didn't say why. It seemed like he'd planned to get back at them by making the elevator malfunction, but things went horribly wrong. One night, while working late, Richard became trapped in the elevator shaft. He was alone, unable to call for help, and he died there. Some reports claimed he cursed the elevator as he died, vowing that no one would use it freely. Not long after his death, strange things started happening. Residents heard voices in the elevator, saw shadows, and experienced sudden malfunctions. That's when the rule started. The elevator only worked if you rode it alone. I sat back, staring at my computer screen. A man full of anger and revenge died alone, and now his presence lingered, demanding solitude. Everything I'd experienced, Lisa collapsing, the whispers, the strange behavior, it all made sense. After learning the truth, I avoided the elevator completely. I started taking the stairs every chance I got, no matter how inconvenient. But one night during a storm, the power went out. I came home late, exhausted, and the stairwell was completely dark. My phone was dead, and I couldn't see a thing. The elevator, for some reason, still had power. I stood there in front of it, debating what to do. My gut screamed at me to stay away, but I didn't have another option. I couldn't climb 3 flights of stairs blind. With shaky hands, I pressed the button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator began its climb. At first, it seemed normal, but as the elevator rose, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath fogging the air. Then the whispers started again. They were soft at first, barely noticeable, but as the elevator kept moving, they grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, it sounded like a chorus of them, overlapping, their words impossible to understand but full of anger. My heart raced and I clutched the railing, willing the elevator to move faster. And then, I saw it. In the mirror on the back wall, there was a figure. It was faint and shadowy, standing in the corner of the elevator. I froze, too scared to move. Slowly, I turned to look, but the corner was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a crushing silence. The air felt heavy and my chest tightened. The elevator jerked suddenly, making me stumble. A moment later, the doors slid open on my floor. I didn't waste a second. I ran out, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was safe inside my apartment with the door locked behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the shadowy figure in the mirror, hearing the whispers in my head. Now I understood why the rule existed. The elevator wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. It demanded solitude, and breaking that rule came with consequences. The rule wasn't about superstition, it was about survival. After everything that happened, I knew I couldn't stay in the building any longer. The shadows, the whispers, the suffocating feeling every time I rode the elevator. It was too much. Moving out felt like my only choice. On my last day, I avoided the elevator as much as I could. I carried box after box down the stairs, even though it was exhausting. By the time I was down to my final box, I felt a mix of relief and dread. For some reason, instead of taking the stairs one last time, I found myself standing in front of the elevator. Just one last ride, I thought. What's the worst that could happen? I hit the button and the doors creaked open. At first, the ride seemed normal. The elevator moved smoothly and the light stayed on. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted to everything, that the strange events were just in my head. But then, halfway down, the elevator stopped. The light flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. The air turned icy and my breath came out in visible puffs. Then I heard it, the whispers. They started soft, blending into the hum of the elevator. But soon they grew louder, overlapping and closing in on me. It wasn't just one voice, it sounded like many, all speaking at once, angry and urgent. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching the box tightly, and then I felt it. A cold hand rested on my shoulder. I froze, too scared to move. The whispers surrounded me louder than ever, until they felt like they were inside my head. The hand tightened, and a voice hissed, "Leave!" Suddenly the elevator jolted, and the lights flickered back on. The hand was gone, and the whispers stopped. When the doors opened, I rushed out, my heart pounding. But instead of the lobby, I found myself in a hallway I didn't recognize. The hallway looked similar to the ones in my building, but it wasn't the same. The walls were slightly warped and the air felt thick and heavy. I walked forward, but something was wrong. Every door was slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. The hallway stretched on forever, no end in sight. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors had already closed. The button panel beside it was blank, offering no way to call it back. I started to panic. I called out, but no one answered. I tried opening a door, but it wouldn't budge. It was then I realized I wasn't leaving. The elevator didn't take me to the lobby. It had brought me somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I don't know how long I've been here, days, maybe weeks. Time doesn't feel real anymore. If you're hearing this, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't test the elevator. Don't break the... It's strange how something as ordinary as an elevator can hide such a dark secret. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever experienced anything like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts or stories. Share them in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps. And if you've had your own creepy experiences, send them my way. I'd love to share them.